The internet promised to make us more productive, more employable, and more economically secure. But as AI begins replacing not just tasks, but entire professional roles, including ones that took many years to reach, is technology making job security itself an obsolete concept? That's why Nick Jain joins us today. He's a Harvard-trained former private equity investor and co-founder of Eagle Rock CFO, who builds systems to replace the leadership that used to require a senior executive. He's got a front row seat to a transformation that's rapidly coming for every industry, whether they're ready or not, and he's under no illusions about what that could mean for the rest of us. Welcome to Ruined by the Internet. I'm Gareth King, and today we're asking, has the internet ruined job security? Nick, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to Ruined by the Internet. To start us off, when it comes to work, the promise of tech has seemingly always been to liberate us from not only the workplace, but the hours as well. In your opinion, do you think that this promise has been delivered, or have we devolved somewhat into an always-on work culture enabled, ironically, by that same technology? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the promise of technology has been more free time for recreation or consumption. And what has happened in practice is people end up working more. And I think there's a very fundamental reason for this. When you are able to work more, that means your competitors are too, your colleagues, the guys you went to school with, the guys who are working in the cubicle next to you. And someone there, it's like a classical prisoner's dilemma. Even if you all are better off if no one decides to work more because technology is doing more of your work, somebody will decide to work a little bit more. And since they can now work from home, they'll decide to work 12 hours a day instead of 8. And you, to keep up, have to do that. And it's a race to the bottom that is enabled by technology, but it's not technology's fault. It is human psychology's fault that we are competitive. Someone out there is out competing you, and you have to keep up. And technology just enables called some of the worst of our natural behaviors or inclinations.
Yeah, that's a great point around that competition. And there's always that competitor that will not take the foot off the gas, so to speak. But we know a lot of talk around technology in general, especially in the workplace, does, as you just mentioned there, relate to productivity. But do you think with such a high velocity of new tools to constantly be across, especially right now, do you think that pressure to constantly be retraining and upskilling across everything, all the new developments that are constantly emerging into the market, do you think that ends up playing a role in what's often mentioned as declining productivity amongst especially digital-based workforces?
So yes and no. There's something called the J curve. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yes.
So yeah, it's like whenever you start something new, you lose a little bit of productivity, you go down and then you go up. And the whole point is when you're engaging in a new activity, and it could be a new skill, if you're learning how to run a different way or throw a ball a different way or use a piece of technology, you have to stick with it long enough so you get out of the bottom part of the J curve and start rising up so it's actually worth it. The problem is if you switch technologies or procedures or protocols or companies too often, you're always stuck in that bottom part of the J curve. So it is okay to be switching technologies quickly, but for any given individual or any given organization, you need to understand how long you're going to be spending down in the J curve.
Just on that point there around the J curve, we can kind of just get into that from that continuation now, the AI that we know is huge right now. And there's a lot of talk around AI, whether it's skepticism, optimism, fear, bullishness, whatever it is, or a mix of everything. One thing that we often see the most AI forward people claim is how they've 10x'd their output or whatever it is simply by utilizing these tools themselves. Now, on a surface level, what's the argument that 10x boost to what they're delivering in the same amount of time for the same amount of wages, if you're a wage earner, is not just a 90% devaluation of their previous labor? How do we square that circle?
I think it assumes the negative view is that you assume a fixed pie. So if everyone is 10x more productive, it means that everyone can work 90% less and therefore you get 90% less wages. But that assumes the consumption of productivity doesn't increase. And I'll give two good examples from history. About 6,000 years ago, when all of our ancestors were running around the fields and forests, hunting and gathering, we, didn't have a lot of food. And then someone or a group of people figured out, hey, we can farm, we can plant forests. And all of a sudden, our productivity in producing food went up roughly somewhere between 100 to 500x. Did that mean everyone just laid around lounging around? No. When you had more food, what happened? More uses for food came up. more people came into existence. So we rapidly consumed more of that resource. We found ways to grow and evolve our society. And that's the more optimistic view, that AI is going to result in such a productivity boom that we will find new ways to apply all that productivity that we've unlocked that it didn't make sense to before, right? 6,000 years ago, it didn't make sense to have cities because you would starve and die until you had that 100x improvement in food productivity. We saw the same with the Industrial Revolution when we moved from steam power to electric power. Electric power was way, way more efficient than you sticking your turbines next to a river somewhere. And we're probably going to see something very similar with AI technologies, that we're going to find more interesting ways to consume it that didn't make economic sense 3 years ago.
Is there a ceiling to how far that I guess, new utilization of that productivity can go, especially if it's not something as fundamental to us as people as, say, food production?
Well, you say food is a fundamental thing, and I agree with that. But I think a lot of people would say that there's lots of other fundamental things. And let's use a silly example of video games, right? Mm-hmm. Video games are such a core part of human life that they are now, beginning to rival pro sports teams in terms of franchise value. That technology, or that entire lifestyle, that resource of video game consumption and all the ecosystem that exists around it, was only enabled by about 30 or 40 years of increases in computing power. Mm-hmm. So what you or I might call unessential is in fact incredibly essential to lots of people. So there's lots of cool things that are going to arise in the post-AI world that you or I may say, hey, this is not part of what it is really to be human. It doesn't involve eating. It doesn't involve relationships. It doesn't involve procreating or making babies. But others will say, well, this is so cool. It is important to my way of life.
Look, that's a fantastic point there around, I guess, the creation of new ways to utilize that. And the example you gave there was the compute power when it came to video games. Now, I guess my question from there is, does something like that rely on someone having that interest in video games and the creativity to imagine new ways of utilizing it? Because I think where I'm going with this is the topic of displacement when it comes to AI specifically right now. So if we are eventually ending up with so many displaced white-collar workers from whatever section or industry that they're from, will people that are potentially displaced through the utilization of AI initially, are they usually the ones that will find new ways of utilizing this additional productivity or ability? Or is it still going to come down to, say, the people that can leverage it the most, uncovering new ways to bring those ex-employees back into different roles? Obviously not in the same company, but just in a general sense. Like, where does this go, do you think?
So, earlier you asked me if I was an optimist or pessimist. I'm an optimist on what these technologies enable. Unfortunately, I'm a pessimist on what it means for the current workforce. So I think there's a lot of people who will be displaced in a fundamental structural way. And we can draw the analogy to the American auto industry. When automation started happening in the middle half of the 20th century, people said, okay, well, these guys can go retrain from knowing how to use a hammer to being machine mechanics. And that's all nice in theory, but in practice, it doesn't happen. And a lot of those people just end up fundamentally displaced. And I can, just very bluntly, I can offer a practical example from what we're doing. So we've built an AI-powered CFO and are out there selling it, right? Are we doing rocket science? No. But can the average person who spent a decade training in finance or in business build what we do? No, it requires a certain amount of aptitude in technology and coding and design that 90% of white-collar workers don't have. Now, of that 90%, maybe a third can actually go learn these skills and reskill themselves, but that still leaves to 60% of displaced workers. The more positive lining is this change is not going to happen over the next year. We're going to see the impacts of this rollout over a decade or 2 decades, not immediately in the next year.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you've raised there around the timeline of it. It's being massively disrupted right now, and it feels like the fear is quite high, and people are starting to realize like, hey, maybe I was a little bit too cynical of this thing. It seems to be progressing a little bit more than I gave it credit for. Is that what's really happening on the ground at the moment? Do you think that people, as you said, should be optimistic of what they'll potentially be able to do in the future? And then how does that lead to that example that you mentioned that you've implemented yourself?
Sure. So again, I think that these technologies the good news is they have very thin parts of the J-curve. Almost anybody can pick up some of these AI technologies, not all of them, and be productive instantly. And as a personal example, I suck at all things graphical. Yet
Uh-huh.
it is very easy for me to pick up Midjourney or Dolly, or I think Google's is Nano Banana too. And within seconds, generate an image that would, I would not just would have taken me hundreds of hours to make before, but I could have never made it that quality. So I think the J curve is actually much thinner for these technologies where it makes sense to adopt them. But there's a big difference between adopting these technologies and building them from scratch. And
Hmm.
I think that's where a lot of people are going to struggle, because you're going to have these people who build these technologies that all of a sudden displace 100 workers or 1,000 workers. And those 1,000 workers are not all capable of building technologies for themselves that find the next new niche.
That's a great summary. Not everybody is capable of being an entrepreneur. That's way daunting for so many people. And I think my concern on that point is what happens to those people. Now, I think it was like a decade ago or something that the phrase learn to code kind of entered the lexicon as a suggestion for what would have been traditionally blue collar workers who saw their industries being automated or something else for various reasons. They were told learn to code. Now, obviously 10 years later, people who've studied coding and program, whatever it is, I'm not an expert on that. They're at this wall now where so many of them are like, I use Claude or I use this tool or whatever. I have only written one line of code in X amount of months. I don't do anything. My job's being eradicated. I see it from the inside. Now, these feel like people that can utilize these tools. For someone that might have been told learn to code, may have picked it up, and now they're facing this eradication of their entire career path. And we see people being told learn a trade now. It does feel like we've come full circle. And I think that, yes, the tools, as you've alluded to, are super powerful if you gain the understanding of them. But whether everybody is capable of doing that, I don't know. And I think where I'm going with this is there's a real focus, and we can see it in layoffs that are, being attributed to AI efficiency. 10 people, 10,000 people, whatever. All of it results in that same level of output or desired level of output, but with less people doing it. And that brings me back to what you were saying, a little while ago there, which was that productivity boom. Is that still going to be the aim? Because that theoretically would rely on the same amount of people 10xing their output. Or will people be or businesses be more likely to say, no, that's the level we need. We'll have one person doing it. 9 of those 10 people, sorry, no job for you. What's happening to the masses here?
So I think there's a slight difference in terms of whether you look at it at the individual level or at the organizational level. At the individual level, these technologies, even if you are non-technical and you just pick up ChatGPT, you can do, or Gemini, or pick your favorite model, you can all of a sudden do, incredible things. And not just chat things. You can build websites, you can make music, you can make videos, you can code, whatever. At the individual level, it's a definitive yes, this increases your productivity. However, human beings don't do things individually. They do things as in organizations, whether that be churches, schools, companies, governments, etc. And when you think about it at an organization level, an organization has kind of 2 or 3 things going on. Firstly, they have the total productivity coming from the sum of their individual employees. Second is they have what's called a coordination task. If you have 10 people put together, they may be 10 times more productive. But if you put 100 together, they're not going to be 100 times more productive, because now you have to manage all those people that communicate. They have to spend time on Slack and email and just explaining, hey, Gareth, I'm working on this, across the hallway from you. That's called a coordination tax. And the bigger you get, the more you pay. Imagine you're a multinational company. You have to coordinate across languages, time zones, cultures, departments, business lines. And then the third is okay, how many ideas, how many business opportunities are there that we would love to be working on? And it's a conflation of those 3 factors. And I think for some organizations, you're going to find that they just have a great business model. They know what they do. They don't have the next business line. For them, it's just productivity means they can half their workforce or cut their workforce by 80%. And we saw that, for example, at Block, which is Jack Dorsey's firm that laid off 40% or plans to lay off 40% of their workforce due to AI technologies, or due in part to AI technologies. And for them, the implicit statement is, hey, we have no other ways to grow other than doing our core business. And our core business is doing so well, we can just do it with fewer people. There's other organizations where they will be like, okay, this productivity means we can go chase all those other ideas we just didn't have the time or money or resources to do before. So whether that's a layoff in terms of shrinking the organization or keeping the organization static, it really depends on how many incremental business opportunities there are for the organization to expand into. If there's not many, they will shrink their workforce. And I think you're going to see that at a lot of companies, right? If you're a typical manufacturing company, the demand for your products is not driven by, you can't just invent new products for the most part. So it's driven by external macroeconomic forces. And for those, they're going to be chopping more jobs on average than they'll be creating. Now, that may be very different in a software firm or a law firm or professional services firms.
Yeah, that's a great point there around the ability to chase new opportunities. Where I'd love for us to go with that now is what companies or what type of businesses would you say are best poised right now to explore new opportunities through this efficiency or productivity gains or whatever it is through these tools? And which ones from your perspective are kind of worse positioned?
I'll make two categories. I think firms that are not making physical products, I think will on average have more opportunities to pursue than those making physical products. Physical products are really determined by how much physical stuff people need. So I think manufacturing firms or things, they're going to focus much more on cost efficiencies than they will on we can make a new product. There will be some exceptions. For example, AI has shown the ability to design new engineering materials better than human beings. So that may result in an explosion of, although those are not manufacturing firms, they're research firms, right? They research it, they develop a new material or a new vaccine, and then somebody else goes and makes it. But going back to that first bucket, firms that are providing an intellectual service, these could be technology firms. So actually, I think that there's two big groups that are going to be winners. Number one are software firms that are going to make new types of software that it just didn't make sense to do before because it might cost you $1 million to crank out a piece of software that now you can do in a few $1,000s. The second is entertainment firms, broadly defined, Hollywood, images, video games, music firms, because the cost of producing the entertainment is going to drop dramatically, meaning that the solo artist can now create a lot of music. Or conversely, a big Hollywood studio that only has $100 million budget sounds like a lot, but the typical Hollywood movie now costs $100 million. So they can make one big movie a year. If their productivity doubles, they may actually, these are creative people for the most part. They would love to go make 10 movies. They just didn't have the budget to do it before. 10x more efficient, they can go make those 10 movies.
Yeah, look, there's 2 points there that I'd love to get into with you now. The first one was around cost efficiencies. And just while we've just looked at it, that creative industry, 10xing output, whatever it is. Before we get into the cost efficiency thing, let's just focus on the ability to make so much more output, say if you are a Hollywood studio. And it seems that the general perception, largely from what I can see, is they are big, they've got money, they don't need to be using this stuff. So it almost creates a backlash in amongst the audiences. And that is before we get even into, let's say, you're an actor, whoever you are, you're the most famous one, you're commanding, let's say, $80 million for a film. Will they, A, still be able to do that? And then what's the flow-on effect once you can produce a film for so much cheaper? And their likeness is potentially up for grabs now. If we do have these studios producing, 100 films for the cost of one previous film, does that just flood everything with so much stuff that it's almost overwhelming for people? Where do you think that Hollywood example or that related industries plays out before we get into just the focus on cost efficiencies?
Hollywood's a great example because we're thinking about Hollywood the way it is today, where you have actors who, command giant salaries, actors or actresses. But if you roll back the clock on Hollywood, specifically American Hollywood, go back about 100 years, actors were not they were famous, but they were not rich. Because what happened was they were developed like products by a studio, where a studio would hire a young actor, begin promoting him or her, but then they would basically be locked into 10 or 20-year contracts with that one studio. So they could not just go work for another studio. So what that meant was, who owned the actor? The actor was basically an asset or an owner, not a free agent of Hollywood. They couldn't just go negotiate with the studio next door and say, Warner Brothers is not paying me enough for this movie. How about you pay me something, a bigger number for that movie? Now, what happened somewhere in I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it's somewhere in the 60s or 70s, there was a specific event, but basically actors became free agents. They were able to pick whatever movie they want. They had their own independent representation. At that point, they became their own products, and the studios were their customers. In today's world, sticking with actors, you're right. We're going through a legal thing about who owns the actor's likeness and voice and stuff. Let's imagine that lands in the actor's favor, that they are still their own asset or their own brand. That's great for them. They'll continue to monetize it. But what I think you're going to discover is a lot of Hollywood studios are going to make up celebrities from scratch. So rather than having it look like Brad Pitt or look like Gareth King, it's just going to be a made up human being that they can have in multiple movies, a persona. And a fun example of this that you see from, again, going back to video game culture is the Master Sergeant from Halo, which, by the way, I've never played. But it's a franchise, right? A guy in a mask wearing a certain uniform costume, or Doom guy from a game that I played 30 years ago. These are franchises where, there's not an actor, there's not a person behind the mask, or even if there's a person behind the mask, it's just a made up character. And yet some company owns the intellectual property behind this name and likeness, not a human being, because it wasn't based on a human being. I saw an article about there was the first successful fake influencer.
Yes, I was going to bring this up in a minute. I'm glad that you have. It's an interesting case.
So I didn't double click too much into it because, but it's not surprising that there's an influencer out there who just doesn't exist and is able to sell whatever products it is selling, and it works.
Yeah, and that it's just on that case there. It is so interesting because it does seem like the majority of people are really not that bothered. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're not thinking about it as this is not a real person. They're just taking it as the communication tool that it is. So it will be very interesting to see how that all plays out. But I'd love to get back onto the point around cost efficiencies that you mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, one of the debates that I've seen quite a lot is around this notion of AI washing, which, a lot of people are saying that this rush to appear at the cutting edge and implementing AI due to a struggling business model is essentially just AI washing huge amounts of redundancies, or even offshoring or outsourcing work remotely, all being framed as optimization via AI. Now, two things there. If it's not being delivered by AI now, are they just offshoring and outsourcing it to, say, a country where the work can be produced for 15% of the local value?
Can you define AI washing? Just because I actually have not heard that term before.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Sorry.
So AI washing would be saying, hey, we need to lay off 20% of our workforce because we're going to be implementing various AI tools. But the theory or the cynicism behind a claim like that is that the AI is not actually sophisticated or doesn't perform well enough to actually replace those people. It's actually just a euphemism or a code for, offshoring work to much lower cost workers, which is obviously enabled by technology again.
Got it. So I guess I have three responses to that.
Mm-hmm.
Number one is, does it really matter? If you're the worker who's laid off, do you really care if it's because some, AI is doing your work, or someone in a different country is doing the work, or, if China's changed macroeconomic trade policy, it ultimately doesn't matter. You lost your job.
No. So
yeah.
Sorry, just don't want to interject on that. Yes, totally agree. You've still lost your job. And I think the reason that, from my perspective, why it is so contentious is AI washing is just throwing more fuel onto what is potentially a really hype-driven fire that every other company looks at. It's like, oh shit, I've got to get on board this AI thing and implement it too. I've got to slash my own workforce. Like, how much of it is hype? How much of it is hope? And what's the reality?
Look, can AI do every job? No, right? I'm a mathematician by training. Can it do high school level math problems? Yes, no problem. Could it do some of my senior college level math problems? No. Will it probably get there in a matter of years? Yes. But today, at least, it cannot handle complex multi-step logic problems. And that's true in finance as well. Basically, anything that involves depending on how you measure it, somewhere between 10 to 100 steps, AIs tend to get lost. Now, in all fairness, that's still smarter than 90% of human beings already, but it's not better than the best 10% of CFOs or lawyers or doctors or whatever. But guess what? The best 10% of doctors means there's still 90% of doctors that AI can beat, right? And so it's not all hype. These technologies have really gotten to the point where they are more capable at mundane tasks that human beings do every day. So like a silly example is for a generic diagnosis, right? For like, hey, you've got a cold, and AI is going to be better at figuring that out than a human being much more quickly as well. Now, if you've got some rare disease, sure, you need a human being or a doctor. But for some, traditional things, which by the way are 90% of what most people do in their day-to-day job, AI can do that more effectively. So that's not hype. Second is, Look, at least in private sector in Western economies, there is an incredible pressure to get more profitable every year. So Google, they may be at 35% profit this year. I'm making up the number, but there's still pressure from their investors, from their board. Can we get from 35 to 40%? And that means the board is saying that to the CEO, and the CEO is executing on that on his or her plans. So whether it be AI or, hey, it's just cheaper in another country, there's going to be pressure economically saying, like, even if we're doing well, we need to do better. And if we're not doing so well, we definitely need to do better. Otherwise, we'll be out of business next year.
Yeah.
Right. And by the way, that's something people often miss. For companies that are not doing well, the choice might be lay off a third of your workforce or lay off 100% of your workforce a year later. Right. Survival,
No, exactly.
Capitalism is ruthless. If you don't do it and your competitor outcompetes you, all of your employees are gone. And, it's truly that. Like, if you get better, you can make your workforce better off, but you're going to hurt everyone else. It's kind of not a zero sum game, but it hurts.
That's a fantastic point. And I totally agree with you on that. Two things that you said there. Whatever the reason, you still lost your job, fine. Like that, it's not really going to affect anybody any differently. It's more the headline story of everyone needs to get an AI because it's replacing workers. And then to your point then around the competition, it's like, oh my God, my competition is more ruthless than me. I've got to compete with them and get more ruthless, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we play that out.
It's not that they're necessarily more ruthless. They've discovered, if your competition discovers the way that they can perform better, one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to be more profitable and they're going to buy you and then implement that in your business, or number two, they're going to cut prices, take your customers, and you're going to go out of business. So in capitalism, again, like if your competitors find a way to be better than you, only two things happen. And number one, they buy you because they're richer than you, or number two, they take all your customers away and you shut down. That is the unfortunate, ruthless fact about capitalism. And that is true regardless of whether you're talking about AI technologies or other technologies.
Hello, you. A quick note before we continue. If this one's got you thinking, and we hope it has, but you're not already following the show, make sure you hit follow or subscribe to Ruined by the Internet so you never miss what we ask next. Now let's get back into it. Yes, absolutely. Now, obviously, if you got to compete, you got to do what you got to do. As you said, capitalism is ruthless. Business is going to business. That's just the way it is, unfortunately. Yeah. But when you mentioned there around, potentially if someone utilizes these tools, because a lot of the cost of many goods or services has got the cost of effort and labor baked into it. If we are reducing so much of that cost of effort and labor out of the production price, does that lead us into price deflation? Or do you think that people will be able to maintain their historical, effort and labor inclusive prices, even though they're very clearly using these new tools, which remove so much of that?
So there's a good answer to that one, which is, look, if you are in a monopoly where you're the only one selling your product, then you can maintain those higher margins and you've captured all that productivity. If you're in any other industry where there's roughly three or more, there's an economic rule, I think, where if you have four more competitors, someone is going to cut prices when they discover a technological innovation. And you see that in almost any other industry, right? Like a good example is phones, right? Yes, Apple is still out there selling an extremely expensive phone, but for everyone else, right, there's been a ruthless price competition. So the phone that you're getting is incredibly, incredibly valuable relative to what they could sell it for. If you look at every other phone that's made by Samsung, Google, whatever, yeah, they seem expensive, like $500 or whatever, but they're not actually, the actual profit margin that these companies are making is quite small because they are pushed by Motorola makes a phone, Samsung makes a phone, Huawei makes a phone, Google makes a phone, right? So you get so much pressure that it actually benefits the consumers. And you see that in almost any productivity gain in any non-monopoly industry. And by the way, most industries are not monopolies, right? Mm-hmm. If you're not one of the top 10 tech companies in the world, you're basically not running a monopoly. You have to be price competitive. Boeing and Airbus, they're in an industry where there's only two companies in the world, and they still have to compete pretty ruthlessly against each other. Notice none of them are making $1 billion of profit a year, right?
Yeah. Look, that's a great example that I can tie back to what you were saying earlier. Like the more opportunities will open up, the more competition, which could potentially make it better for consumers.
It's definitely going to be better for consumers. Yeah. Definitely better for consumers, not necessarily better for producers.
But where does that leave us? When you say producers, is I guess the second order effect of that less workers? You know what I mean? Like there'll be obviously a huge drive to cost optimize as far as possible on something like that.
So look, there's going to be a lot of legacy players in services businesses or technology businesses that are going to go bankrupt because somebody can rebuild what they did much, much faster, much cheaper without technical debt or organizational debt. And those organizations are just going to, go away entirely because they're going to be outcompeted. The next set of organizations are those that are going to evolve, but they will tend to evolve more slowly. And so instead of having a $3 billion consulting firm, you're going to have a $1 billion consulting firm because 2/3 of your business were taken away by new competitors that are going to emerge from smaller organizations. The net of this still, this is where I'm a little bit more pessimistic, is in an era where AI can be reasonably intelligent. And I don't mean generalized artificial intelligence, but rather where it can do work that historically required a human brain and decision-making judgment to do. I think a lot of those jobs are going to be permanently gone. And because AI is a generalist, I'm not sure a lot of those displaced workers will find work in the new world. And again, I'm not saying this I'm saying this quite negatively. I think we're headed towards very much, maybe not a dystopian society, but the only way that we will function is with some form of universal basic income. Whether or not we politically achieve that
Yes.
is a separate issue.
Yes. Look, I mean, that's a great segue to UBI, but I think just on that, work displacement stuff, one thing that we never got into is your example of how you've implemented those tools yourself. And from there, like what the outcomes have been.
Sure. So I'll provide two examples. One is, so we just launched a business. It's just me and my business partner right now. But here's the cool thing. Almost all of our work internally is done using Claude code. So our emails, our marketing, our blogs, our website coding, the analyses we do for our client, and it is all done in Claude code. So we're not even opening up, I don't even open up my Gmail inbox anymore. I just have it, an AI agent do it for me, summarize, rewrite the emails. Sometimes I look at them, sometimes I don't, and just hit send. So that's internal productivity. But then let's talk about what my external product is. So what we built was an AI CFO. And our entire hypothesis was, look, if you're $1 billion company, you can hire a really smart CFO to help make your business better. But that person costs $1 million a year. The average business can't afford $1 million a year. What if you're a $5 million a year business or a $10 million a year business? You'd love to have somebody that smart being your CFO, but you can't afford him or her. So our idea was there's all these people who would love to have CFOs, but they can't afford to have a world-class CFO. So let's build a piece of technology for them. So if our hypothesis is right, then we have not taken away anybody's job, but we've created value for our customers. And so far it's working, right? These are all customers that didn't have CFOs in place. They would have loved to have a CFO, but they didn't want to spend $500,000 on that. Now we're giving them a piece of technology that costs $40,000 or $50,000 a year. Good, it's good for us, but really it's great for them because now that piece of technology is helping them make, I think for the average client, they paid us $10,000, I think, over the last 2 months each. And on average, they made about $2 million.
And the way that you've just broken it down there, I think that is that soon to be revealed opportunities that a lot of people will be able to capitalize on and make. Now, obviously what you've built there is a market for that, which is bringing that very, very high level knowledge, ability, whatever it wraps up in, to those companies that can't generally afford to pay for that. But I think my question on that, when it comes to not taking anybody's job, yes, on paper, it's just another service going out into the market. But is the reality that these companies would have had let's say a lower level financial controller, but now that they've got your tool that comes along, which, as you said, it's not directly taking anybody's job. It's providing a quality of ability, knowledge, everything like that, as you've just outlined. But does it in a way replace that person? I think if we play that out to its logical conclusion, as these tools get smarter and all that agentic AI gets better and better at replicating that human experience and knowledge, where does that at an aggregate play out once, I guess, the average worker is no longer needed? Do you know what I mean?
Yes. So let me break apart where we are today. So our technology today does not replace a lower level worker or even a different worker. So if you think a CFO does a very different job than a controller. A controller is really focused on accounting, and a CFO is focused on business advisory. How do we make the business more profitable? Cutting costs, adding revenues, decreasing risk, whatever. One is an analysis job and one is a record keeping job. Both are important, but in different ways. So at least today, our technology is not really replacing any accountants, controllers, treasurers, etc. That might change in the future, either with our technology or someone else's. But at least today, we're literally not replacing anyone. We're literally adding a function that they could not afford before. Now, if we roll forward to the future, yes, you're really going into kind of that pessimistic prediction I laid out, which is these technologies, if not today, definitely in the next 5 or 10 years, are going to be smarter than almost any white collar digital worker. Not just smarter, but they can do your job. And that it's a future that's coming reasonably quickly. I think well within the next decade. And the only limiting factor is how quickly organizations either adopt these technologies or are forced to adopt these technologies by either shareholders or competition. And yeah, we look, again, I'm quite pessimistic on what this bodes for the white collar workforce over the next decade. I'll use me as an example. If I wanted to spin up a world class marketer, I think I get somewhere between a day to a week is what it would take me to code one up, stick an AI brain in it, and all of a sudden I have an employee that would cost me $80,000 a year in a week.
Mm.
And after that, by the way, if you ran any agent 24/7, like 100% of the time at full capacity, roughly they cost about $1,800. That is cheaper than outsourcing to a lower cost country. And no human being works 24/7, 365. So the technology is almost there, either there or almost there.
Yeah, look, and that's a great point there. That if we, and again, me just as a layperson, I'm trying to play that to its logical conclusion, where it just becomes such a no-brainer that why would you have humans working when you can be doing this? And then it makes me think where we started back off with the promise of that leisure time, not just much, much more productivity slammed into the same amount or even more work. But one thing I've just remembered we didn't get into, I'd love to hear your thoughts on if we do get to that point where I guess the 24/7 nature, the very, very low cost of these agents displaces almost all white collar workers, as you mentioned. Regardless of whether we do get that leisure time back to indulge in our passions like a lot of people imagine we will be able to, or we end up in some kind of dystopian hellhole, the topic of UBI. It does come up a lot. A lot of people theorize about it. Me personally, I'm fairly cynical that it would ever actually come to fruition without some gigantic political shift. I'd love to hear your take on it as an idea and whether it could happen or not.
So I think that firstly, I do genuinely think we're headed towards some sort of socioeconomic cataclysm where a lot of white collar workforces are going to be displaced. And that's particularly difficult for Western economies that are largely knowledge economies, not labor, not, physical goods economies. So oddly enough, AI may not really matter so much for China or India, but may absolutely devastate, Australia or the United States or England or Canada or whatever. So that's number one. So when you end up in that world, and I think we're, in our life, within kind of yours and my lifetime, Gareth, I think we end up in a situation where a democratic nation is going to vote in a UBI favorable political party. And it will be a fundamental shift away from the kind of laissez-faire capitalism that we've had for most of the last, 500 years in Western countries. But it's going to happen because the alternative is, there's going to be riots in the street. So I do think UBI is going to happen. However, the thing people don't talk about is how much, right? Right? How much money is the government going to give you or our AI overlords going to give you? And I think it is just enough to make their consciences feel good or keeping you happy enough that you produce whatever else they still need you for. And that's not a very high number, right? The amount of money that you need to give me, let's use me as an example, to prevent me from picking up a gun and starting a riot or anarchy is not actually that high.
No,
right? It's very easy to keep people happy with a very modest amount of income.
No, absolutely. And it's in the name, isn't it? Basic income. And one of the other side arguments that I've seen in discussions around UBI is, well, without that motivation to actually go out and earn, why would people do anything? And I don't know, I find that a really weak argument simply because I think as humans, we are driven we're curious beings and a curious species. But if those opportunities are still there to do more, like everyone's got their needs taken care of, that doesn't mean that everybody will settle for that. People will still want to maximize their ability. So I think it is a very interesting concept. Like I said, I'm a little bit cynical.
Can I jump in there for
Yeah,
a second?
Of course.
So you said, look, not everyone will want to settle for that. You're right. But the key word you said is not everyone. I think if you go look at the economics research, lots of people are okay just being average, right? Or just getting a minimum amount of income. Most people are okay just working a 9-to-5 job and earning $50,000, $60,000 a year and not wanting to go for that $100,000 job or that $1 million job. So even in a UBI world, I think you are right that some people will try and achieve more. But I think you'd be perhaps negatively surprised at how many people are just going to be, this is good enough, I will live and not die.
No, I agree with you. I think a lot of people will take that approach to it and, utilize that leisure time. I just think that the argument around, well, why would anybody do anything more? I think it doesn't take
that's a
into
terrible
account
argument. Yeah, that's a terrible argument. Some people are just creative and driven, right?
Totally. Yeah. It'll be interesting whether it actually happens or not through, like you said, the AI overlords being taxed for each displaced worker to pay for things like that. Yeah, so I guess we'll all be keeping quite a close eye on that one. But you mentioned before that 10-year timeline. Is that your estimate of it, or do you think it could be less? Do you think it could be longer?
Here's my kind of prognostications. Number one, I think the technology is already there to replace the majority of white-collar workers, okay? So I think the generally reasoning LLM, so the top 1 or 2 models from each of the big AI companies is already smart enough to do better than the average employee in almost any white-collar function. The reason I say 10 years is 2 things need to happen. Number one, organizations need to either agree to adopt these technologies or be driven out of business or outcompeted by people who do. And number 2, even though the LLM is smarter, you still have to train it on doing a specific job. And I don't mean training in the AI sense, but rather think of an LLM as or an AI as a generally smart human being. You have to tell them, hey, this is your job, go do this. Just like you have a week or month-long onboarding with an employee. So you imagine you're a large company, you have 100,000 employees that do 1,000 different jobs. You will then have to teach the AI or onboard the AI to do those 100 different jobs or 1,000 different jobs. Right. So that's why it's going to take 10 years, not because the technology is not smart enough, but because you have to onboard the AI and tell it, hey, go do this job.
With that, how do you think the future of jobs plays out from here in a general sense?
My 2 cents is that we're going to see a lot more independent founders show up, number one. And number 2, we're going to see a mass displacement of white-collar workers over the next decade or so, about a third of which will adapt to the AI native world, and maybe 2/3 of which are going to really struggle in the new world that we're entering. I'm not saying that is a good thing. I'm just saying genie's out of the bottle, and I think that's the way we're headed.
Well, Nick, you've definitely given us a lot of very interesting and some frankly quite daunting stuff to think about. Just to finish up then, what's a belief or concern that you have about technology right now that you wish was getting more attention?
So I think everyone's talking about AI in terms of how smart it's getting, whatever the next new model is, whatever the next new app is. The thing I think people are not concentrating enough on is the cost of AI. And what's really, really dramatic is that the cost of AI or the cost of AI tokens is dropping by, depending on how you measure it, somewhere between 70 to 95% a year.
Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. What have you got coming up and where can people follow what you're up to?
For people who want to get in touch with me, I think the best way is to go to our company website, eaglerockcfo.com. There you have our email, our LinkedIn's, as well as the opportunity to try our technology totally for free. Again, eaglerockcfo.com. Thank you so much.
For more info on what we've discussed today, check out the show notes. If you enjoyed this one, you can subscribe to Ruined by the Internet on your favorite podcast app and help spread the word by sharing this episode or leaving a review. I'm Gareth King. See you next time.